Good morning. This is Rob Jenin, the City Director of Young Business Leaders. I wanted to share with you again during this season where we're in an extraordinary time of isolation and social distancing. Wanted to share with you a community Bible study which YBL has been going through. This study, Passion and Pentecost, came about because of our concern for our community at a time when we're all isolated. We need to hear God's word even more, and particularly during this season of Easter and Passion Week and then Pentecost. I see some serious and important parallels between the experiences of Jesus and his sufferings and the early church and their time of patient preparation. And so that's the title of our series, 4 week series of 20 to 30-minute Bible studies. We have decided to do a community study for these reasons: to keep our heart healthy and outward looking in our community, to pray together, Bible reflection, to keep our priorities straight so that we're really hearing from God and from His Word rather than just from the news or our own fears. And then the spiritual exercise, the idea that we want to grow instead of atrophy during this season. And that is just so important, that we would grow rather than shrink in this time. We're not just trying to survive, we're actually hoping that God will use this time to grow us and make us more faithful. So this week is the Passion Week study, and the reason for this during the Holy Week is the idea that Jesus understands our sufferings, that we do not have a great high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but that he was tempted in every way as we were, yet without sin. And Maundy Thursday, the day of this study, uh, we call it Maundy Thursday from the Latin mandatum, meaning commandment, based on John 13:34, where Jesus said, "A new commandment I give you: love one another as I have loved you." Now, this is an old command, right? Leviticus 19:19 says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." But there is something new about this command. Namely, we are to love as Jesus has loved us. So, what makes this commandment new is this idea that we are to love as he loved us. So, how did Jesus love us? Well, Jesus loved us by giving his life for us. John 15:13, as we think in Easter week and this Passion Holy Week, Jesus told his disciples, "Greater love has no one than this, than he lay down his life for his friends. And you are my friends if you do what I command." And so that is just a mind blowing thing that Jesus would lay down his life for us. The King of the universe, in very nature God, lays down his life for us and calls us friends. That's even more astounding when you stop and consider where we really were. We were not merely indifferent to God or just kind of unknown with God, but we were actually God's enemies. Romans 5:7 to 10 says this: "For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare to die. But God shows his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we've now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from him by the wrath of God? For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, how much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life?" So it's more astounding when you put it in context that not only has Jesus loved us, called us friends, laid down his life for us, but he actually did all of that before we were even known as friends. He did this when we were enemies and actively working against him. Now, Jesus gave his life not simply as a display of concern, but because his life was what was necessary to meet our deepest need. What do I mean by that? Well, I like this quote from Winston Churchill: "It's not enough that we do our best. Sometimes we have to do what is required." So the idea is, if I were to run out and say, "I love you," and I went and got hit by a bus, and I said, "This is a demonstration of my devotion of love for you," you might think that it was a probably tragic and misguided, but sincere demonstration of love. But it didn't accomplish or improve your life. If anything, if we were truly friends, it would actually make your life worse off. But Jesus gave his life to meet our desperate need. because he knew that only his life could take care of our greatest problem. Jesus told the disciples, John 12:23 and 24, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." Now, why is this so important? Jesus understood this idea that he had to become a seed, that a seed, if it remains by itself, it's just a seed. In order for it to become a plant, it must die. The seed must die for a plant to live. Jesus is saying intentional, voluntary suffering for the sake of his love was the point of his entire life. This suffering was why he came, and it was how his purpose would be accomplished in our lives. John 10:45, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. That is so important to understand. He gave his life as a ransom, as a payment. We were sold into slavery and sin, and the only way to be bought back or gotten free from our sins was to have a payment that could redeem us. And the only payment sufficient was God and God's perfect, sinless Son. Now, we think about this Hebrews 12:2 and 3, why this is so important during Passion Week for us to do this. Hebrews 12:2 and 3 says we should fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, I want you to understand, first off, this idea that Jesus gave his life for a joy that was set before him. He endured great shame. The cross was a disgraceful way to die. It was an incredibly painful way to die. And as we're going to talk about shortly, he endured many other things. Why did he do it? And how did he do it um, joyfully? He did it joyfully because of what he knew his death would accomplish. His death would accomplish union between us and God and the making of many sons and daughters for God, increasing the size and the blessing of God's family. And so that's why he scorned its shame and he considered it a joy. And we're told to consider him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. That is so important. And we see here fixing our eyes on Jesus and consider him who endured such opposition. What we want to do here during this Passion Week, this Holy Week consideration, is to just reflect on what Jesus actually did, the pains he endured and suffered. We want to consider the opposition he faced so that we will not grow weary or lose heart. If you're in a tough and discouraging and difficult time right now, be encouraged that Jesus knows. So I just want to reflect on that. How did Jesus experience suffering for us? What ways did he suffer? I'm just going to walk through those with you. First of all, consider the garden, the anxiety and apprehension that Jesus felt in the garden. It says literally that he prayed, and it was as if the sweat from his body falling to the ground was his blood. It was that costly, that emotionally draining, the earnestness with which he was praying. And he was praying, Father, um, if possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. So if you know what it's like to have this sort of nameless or named dread kind of approaching, sometimes that's the hardest part of our suffering is that kind of unknown stage where we fear the pain or the suffering or the hardship that is to come. Jesus knows what that's like, and more so than we can even imagine, because he, in fact, as we're going to talk about, bore pain and suffering and isolation that we have never endured. Secondly, Jesus experienced betrayal. We know that Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss, of all things, disgracefully using a sign of love and tenderness as a marker to identify Jesus as the one who was to be given over and executed. So, if you have experienced anything like this in these times where you have been disappointed or discouraged by someone that you expected would be there for you in this crisis, just know that Jesus has been betrayed at a level, by a friend who had been with him for 3 years constantly, endured all sorts of hardship. and yet sold him out for the price of a slave for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus knows abandonment as well. And this is important to think through in terms of just the idea that um, sometimes it's hard to imagine somebody turning on us and betraying us, though I'm sure it's happened. But think about the disciples. You know, if betrayal is giving evil for good, abandonment is giving nothing in exchange for good. um, People that we thought were our friends who would be supportive and there for us, maybe who haven't, a boss who you thought would be loyal to you after all the hours you put in, still laid you off. So, abandonment, Jesus knows what that's like. All of his most trusted followers betrayed him in fleeing in fear during the arrest of Jesus and his trial. And then we think about the physical pain. Just from the beginning of the trial, they started abusing him. They put a bag over his head and they beat him in the face. They abused him. They whipped him with cords. They um, they put a crown of thorns on his head. They finally then nailed him to a cross. And for anyone who is fearful of physical pain and suffering or has gone through possibly the coronavirus or some other deep sickness and been gasping for air, if you have asthma, just know that being executed on the cross, what finally kills you is suffocation when you can no longer boost yourself up enough to get breath, but your lungs basically suffocate as your body hangs in a position where you cannot breathe. And so Jesus is familiar with physical pain. He knows suffering. He also knows mockery. He has endured mockery and abuse. When they put a bag over his head, they began to beat him in the face and say, "Prophesy, who hit you?" He endured mockery from the soldiers. He endured mockery from the leaders. The leaders, when he was on the cross, sneered at him and said, "If he is the Christ, let him come down now and we'll believe in him." So, important for us to understand, if you've been mocked, maybe you feel like Christians are being mocked in the news or in your local paper. Um, Whatever the abuse is, that Christians are foolish or hate science and somehow they're spreading the virus because they want to meet at church, whatever abuse we might have heaped on us, just know that Jesus has experienced far more and he did it for us. And lastly, and most significantly, isolation. Jesus experienced isolation on the cross. He was utterly and completely alone, not just abandoned by his friends, not just betrayed by Judas, but as he had the whole weight of sin pressed down upon him, he experienced isolation from the Father. This unbelievable, unfathomable idea that God the Father could be separated from the Son, that his face and his smile and his approval turned away, as all of God's presence that Jesus experienced in that moment was the wrath of God raining down upon him in judgment. And he did that and he bore that. He became a sacrifice of atonement and was forsaken and isolated and punished as an evildoer on our behalf. So he experienced all those things. I just say this: Jesus understands our sorrows and our suffering. Not only does he understand our pain, he's come to carry that pain for us. So, two things I want you to carry away this morning. Number one, Jesus understands pain. He came to carry yours. So don't carry it alone. Go to him. Number one, he was despised and rejected. This is Isaiah 53, 3 through 5. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. So Jesus understands. Isaiah wrote those words. Jesus is the suffering servant who carried our afflictions, and by his wounds we are healed. So you can go to him with your pain. Now, Jesus said that he went into the ground as a seed to die, to produce a plant which would produce many seeds and to bear much fruit. Jesus is calling you to be a seed too. This is so significant in Hebrews 13 as we reflect on the death of Christ as he gives himself for us. This is what the writer of Hebrews calls us to. He reminds us of the Old Testament picture of the high priest on the Day of Atonement. He says this: the high priest carries the blood of animals into the most holy place as a sin offering, but the bodies are burned outside the camp. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we're looking for the city that is to come. Because we have a joy set before us, we can go with Jesus. We can follow him outside the camp and to bear disgrace and shame with him, knowing that we have an enduring city he has purchased for us. And so during this Passion Week, I just want to encourage you to celebrate, to worship Jesus, and to be grateful that we have a great high priest who has been tempted and suffered in every way we have, yet without sin. Praise be to God.